I am the whole tribe.
The circus agrees with your request of me.
Four on the floor, and one more fall on the floor. That's one for the four. To get funky on the dance floor. Four on the floor, and one more fall. That's 24. 28 through 32. Now one more fall is here to make you dance. Get down, get in the groove. And when there's 6 feet there, we swear. When all the falls are on the floor, it's 4G. Then it's 4G. Then
28.